Hello and welcome to a new episode of Love Muslims Critique Islam, Part 12, Slavery. Throughout this series of videos, I'll be sharing with you the truth of Islam that you just won't get from the mainstream media, nor will you get from Muslims. So let me reveal to you the secrets imams don't want you to know, and I'll take you on a journey of absolute truth. It is normal for Muhammad to have slaves, both male and female. That's been accepted into the doctrine of Islam. Some would find themselves as spoils of war, and some would be traded. Most would be women and children, and some women who were married will find their husbands and other male relatives killed, except for a few lucky ones who could become eunuchs. Eunuchs would always attract a higher price, as they would often make better soldiers, and of course ideal guards for harems. But castration is not allowed in Islam, so the men will have to be made into eunuchs outside Islamic territory before being shipped home to market. Muslims who take captive women as their concubine slave are really exercising their right to do so, and Allah's given permission. But the Quran does specify that slaves must be treated well, and allows slaves for good conduct to be able to buy their freedom, and even tells the owner to financially contribute towards the cost. Most of the captured females would join Muhammad's growing band of concubines, and to become a member of his concubines gave them a slightly elevated status with more privileges than ordinary slaves, and even more so, and rules determining the paternity and ownership of the concubines is outlined in Sharia law. Should a concubine become pregnant with her master's child, she is elevated still further, and her child will have equal status with her master's wives. Should a concubine be granted freedom, not let go as such, but she will be promoted as a mistress. So the Quran is it does state the number of wives allowed, no more than 4, unless you're Muhammad, of course. But the number of captured women you desire for marriage is limitless. Now, through Jihad, Islam expanded, and as the Islamic empire grew, so did the ever-increasing supply of slave. The slave trade was very lucrative and profitable for Muhammad, and he would use his network to buy and sell, trade, and use them as currency. People were a commodity, and the result of spoils of war, the booty to be shared among his followers, and all war prisoners would be automatically made a slave. Slave masters would raid Christian-based countries throughout the Ottoman Empire, from Spain to Asia. Christian boys from the ages of 8 to 20 were regularly taken from the homes by force and made to convert to Islam. They would be trained as elite soldiers, and any parent that dared to resist would be hanged in their doorway. From the 15th century, it has been estimated that around 1 million boys were taken in a practice that ended in the 19th century, when the Ottomans turned their attention to Africa. Raiding pirate parties from North Africa in the 16th and 18th centuries would be dispatched to go people hunting and capture slaves throughout Western Europe traveling to Spain, Italy, Portugal, France, and the British Isles, even as far north as Iceland. In Spain and Italy, churches would have special collections to ransom their children back, who were often kept in horrendous conditions and worked to death. Islam in the Indian region took a hold from the 7th century when the Arabs invaded the area to capture many Hindus for various sultans. Thousands of Indian slaves were treated with severity and massacred as temples and plantations were destroyed. At any one time, it was estimated that the Sultan Firoz Shah held about 180,000 slaves in his court, 40,000 of which were palace guards in the 14th century. So it went on then. In the Islamic Republic of Mauritania of West Africa, slavery has been part of their history since the 8th century when it became Islamic, and only black people were enslaved and conscripted into the Islamic army. Several attempts have been made to outlaw slavery throughout the 20th century, when forming slave armies were revived in the early 1960s, but have been met with stiff opposition. Some tried to defend slavery by citing that the slaves were merely servants who have been for the families, the same families, for generations, but those who have managed to escape speak of harsh brutality and harsh treatments. A 20-year civil war in Sudan came about after Islamic law came into force in 1983, which split the country into two, north and south. The Islamic north frequently would capture and enslave the mainly Christian inhabitants of the south. The same old familiar story would play out, with men being killed, children put to slave work, and women would become sex slaves and pass through the network of slave dealers and really brutally treated. Similarly, in Pakistan, it is mainly the Christian minority population who are used as very low-paid labourers employed by Muslims. A militant Islamic group would kidnap and enslave boys as young as 6 years old from Christian villages, keep them in poor conditions and beat them regularly to sell for slave labour or for sex work. In Islam, slavery was abolished centuries later in the Ottoman Empire. Tunisia and Egypt, thanks to strong pressure from Christian-based Western nations, but in parts of Africa, it carried on to the 20th century after influence from the UN finally had it abolished. It was as late as 1952 when Qatar outlawed it, and was followed by Saudi Arabia and Yemen in 1962, UAE in 1963, South Yemen in 1967, and finally Oman in 1970. Islamic states were the last to change. The practice of enslaving captured Christians goes on today, unfortunately, and has been in the news fairly recently with Leah Sharibu. She was the latest victim of Islamic brutality when she was kidnapped by Boko Haram from her school in Yobe State, Nigeria, along with 110 of her schoolmates. Her friends have since been released after converting to Islam, but brave Leah is holding out and clinging on to her Christian faith, and consequently her kidnappers have vowed to make her a slave for life for not converting. While the politically correct elite choose to do nothing, Christians around the world continue to pray for her release. Muslims will argue that slavery was in the Bible, therefore is part of Christianity. Slavery is in the Bible, yes, but it's not like the image of slavery that we have been accustomed to with whips, chains, and brutality. Slaves then were treated more as family members and part of the household, in fact, and were even given an option to be freed after 7 years through a Mosaic law, but didn't choose to be so often, and chose to stay with their masters, and considered them more as employers rather than slave owners. Um, Slavery is not part of Christianity, as Jesus never had any, and came to set the oppressed free. A fact not lost on William Wilberforce. You can see there in the picture. He was a Christian English member of the British Parliament in 1780, where he would continuously lobby for social reform. He spent 18 years putting forward motions to abolish slavery, which was finally made law in 1833, shortly before he died. And Britain led the world in being the first country to ban slavery. Whilst Christian nations were involved with the slave trade in the Middle Ages, they were the first to acknowledge its abomination and abolish the practice and follow God's example of setting free the Jews from Egyptian slavery in Exodus. Slavery for Muslims is an infinite part of its nature and culture, stemming from the pattern set by Muhammad and his followers. And Christians and other non-believers would always be their targeted victims. Islamic text doesn't describe black people very well, to say the least. Blacks are ugly and misshapen because they live in a hot country. Like the crow among mankind are the zany, that's the African blacks, for they are the worst of men and the most vicious of creatures in character and temperament. And we know that the zany are the least intelligent and the least discerning of mankind and the least capable of understanding the consequences of actions. The Shu'ubaya maintain that eloquence is prized by all people at all times, and even the zany, despite their dimness, their boundless stupidity, their obtuseness, their crude perceptions, and their evil dispositions, make long speeches. Well, so do you, mate. Well, there we go. The picture there is of captured black slaves rescued by the British Royal Navy from Muslim slave trading ship when Britain was enforcing its ban on slave trading in the 19th century. And within Islamic texts, there are several references to Muhammad owning black slaves and other reports describing the mistreatment of slaves, where Muhammad is smiling while a slave is beaten for losing a camel. In Ibrahim Ishaq, page 243, Muhammad even describes Satan as a black man and that black people are going to hell. Surah 3:106 and Surah 39:60. And so we read this then in Abu Dawud, book 004, number 18142. This is narrated by Asma bint Abu Bakr. We came out for performing Hajj along with the Apostle of Allah. When we reached Al-Aray, the Apostle of Allah alighted and we also alighted. Aisha sat beside the Apostle of Allah and I sat beside my father Abu Bakr. The equipment and personal effects of Abu Bakr and of the Apostle of Allah were placed with Abu Bakr's slave on a camel. Abu Bakr was sitting and waiting for his arrival. He arrived, but he had no camel with him. He asked, "Where is your camel?" He replied, "I lost it last night." And Abu Bakr said, well, here was only one camel, even that you have lost. He then began to beat him, while the apostle of Allah was smiling, saying, look at this man who is in the sacred state, putting on ihram. What is he doing? So what color was Muhammad? Well, Islam is quick and anxious to point out that Muhammad was Caucasian with the complexion of a white man. Abu Juhayfa reported this. I saw Allah's messenger, peace be upon him, that he had white complexion and had some white hair. Salim narrated that his father said this. Sometimes I remember the words of the poet when I was looking at the face of the messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, on the pulpit. He did not come down until all the waterspouts in Al-Madinah were filled with rain, and I remember what the poet said. He has a white complexion, and rain is sought by virtue of his countenance. He cares for the orphans and protects the widows. These are the words of Abu Talib. Now, however, the usual discrepancies within the Islamic texts, as you can see from the picture there, in these two quotations concerning Muhammad's description, and I'll let you decide which one is correct. So when asked what color Muhammad was, the description came back as, well, not completely white. But then again, anyone who says that the Prophet was black should be killed. The Prophet was not black. The great Muhammad Ali, 3 times heavyweight champion boxer of the world, knocked himself out with this mishit of a punch aimed at the established white society in America when he changed his name in 1964. His name at birth was Cassius Marcellus Clay, who was named after his father, who was named after a politician who worked for Abraham Lincoln for the abolition of slavery in America. But he changed his name when he converted to Islam in 1964 to that of 2 white owners of black slaves of the 7th century. Well, there we go. Poor man, misinformed. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this insight into Islam. In the next episode, I will be exploding the myth that Islam enriched Spanish culture. But in the meantime, it's bye-bye from me. Bye-bye.